A while back, we did our video entitled, "Does the Funeral Industry Really Hate Caitlin Doherty?" And we mentioned how so much of our information that we receive on a day-to-day basis here in Australia comes from a US perspective. And that seemed to really resonate with a lot of people. So this video is for the many people who messaged me asking what the difference is between the Australian and US funeral industries that they may not be aware of because of this dominating US perspective in our media. Please give us a like and consider subscribing if you learned something new. Now let's talk the US versus Australian funeral industries. So before we begin, there are two things to note. One, yes, we are looking at the differences, but that doesn't mean that one is better than the other. Usually. Okay, there are a couple that may be better than the other, but most of the time they're just facts. And two, if you've seen our video on InvoCare, Australia's funeral mega company, I left something out that will make some of this make a bit more sense. So pre-1990s, Australia's funeral industry was comprised of only small local funeral homes. Then in the early 1990s, shit hit the fan when two of the largest US funeral corporations, Service Corporation International and Stewart Enterprises, decided to come to Australia. They started buying every small funeral home they could get their hands on, but concentrated mainly in the capital cities. In addition to this, they started buying up cemeteries and crematoriums. Within 2 years, SCI owned 75% of the crematoriums in New South Wales, and well-known local companies became brands that they could market. They implemented the business practices that we know today, the vertical structure, the upselling, the sell-at-all-costs attitude. And then a mere 10 years later, after their international spending spree, they left claiming financial distress. Macquarie Bank bought them out, but the US companies still had a 20% share. And after many complicated financial and legal maneuvering, InvoCare was created to take over from these companies. And as we said in our video on InvoCare, just recently there have been bids by US companies to buy InvoCare out. So all that explains how we got into the mess that we are now in. And as for why all this was allowed to happen in the first place, analysts put it down to money, bullying, and legal loopholes. Analysts who have looked back on this also describe their retreat as being similar to the Starbucks retreat from Australia in 2008. They didn't cater to the locals. They tried to push their US business practices and products onto the Australian market, and the Australian market told them where they could shove it. So with that in mind, onto the differences, and we'll start with the most obvious one. Embalming. We've gone into this many times on this channel, but for those who don't know, in Australia we rarely use embalming, while in the US it is a common practice. You will not be pressured by a funeral director to have a loved one embalmed over here. I've helped organise many funerals with many different companies, and the most you will hear of it is simply asking yes or no, do you want the body embalmed? The only times when you must be embalmed in Australia is when you are buried in any sort of above ground crypt or the body is being repatriated internationally. So if for some strange reason you are pressured into having your loved one's body embalmed, tell them to shove it. Go call another funeral director and get them to pick up the body, and then report the initial funeral director to the NFGA and Choice, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Viewings. This was another cultural export that SCI brought. The home vigil began to fall out of favour in Australia around the same time as it did in the US. War is a bitch. And funeral companies decided to fill the gap with viewings at their facilities. Obviously not out of the goodness of their own heart, but because money could be made. The body obviously needed to be prepped for viewing, so there's a fee. And the funeral director's time to show the body, there's another fee. And obviously it would be better for the family to see their loved one as if they were alive rather than dead, so embalming is a must, and there's another fee. And Aussies watching this will be rolling their eyes and knowing exactly why this didn't take off here. It's just not in line with our culture. But in saying that, there are cultures within Australia, including the Italian and Croatian communities, who do have these kind of viewings, as is their right. The difference is you won't be pressured into or expected to have a viewing like many parts of the US do. And I will mention here that viewings are conducted every day in Australia with the body not being embalmed. If you choose to have a viewing, no matter the scale, it is the norm here for the body not to be embalmed. It is amazing what a bit of makeup and hairstyling can do. Above ground crypts. These include single crypts for one person, family crypts, and mausoleums. Now, before SCI came here in the 90s, Australia really didn't have the laws necessary for above ground crypts. But SCI had known the profits that could be had by having this legalized, so they pressured the authorities for making change to the laws on the basis that it would be discriminatory to deprive people of the opportunity to spend a small fortune on burying the dead. The laws did change, and SCI built some massive mausoleums along the East Coast. To say it went badly is an understatement, because while yes, we have a large Italian and Mediterranean population even back then, they had taken to burying the dead in the traditional way and didn't want to change. So we do have mausoleums here in Australia, but they aren't built often. Now it should be said that not all above ground crypts in the US are there specifically to make money. Many are there because there's a bit of a water issue, and I'm looking at you, New Orleans. They've been building above ground crypts for 200 years to protect their bodies from flooding. Remember those pictures of caskets floating down the street after Hurricane Katrina that we all saw? Well, that's what these crypts are trying to prevent. You want your loved one to be where you left them, not going for a joyride down Main Street. Caskets. While we do have lavish, supersized, way over the top caskets over here, you will rarely see them. In fact, they are usually kept out the back and only brought out when an Italian or Asian customer comes in, known to be the big spenders in the Australian funeral industry. Us Aussies are more fan of the more modest coffin or casket. Although there are starting to be less coffins available because they're not really, shall we say, size inclusive. Now, like we said earlier, we don't often have viewings here, so it's not much of a problem, and they're still regularly used. But coffins were mostly phased out in the US because stuffing a body into a regular sized coffin is not a good look for viewing, which they often have over there. And while we're on the subject of caskets, I read on a US casket supplier website that of all the caskets bought in the US each year for the past decade, 60% were made of steel. Now, I didn't believe that. So I looked at government websites, consumer advocacy websites, and more. And it turns out, yeah, 60 to 75% of the caskets sold in the USA are made of steel. And that just blew my little noodle. I mean, what do you say to that? And not only are they made of steel, but many are hermetically sealed and sold to customers as being more protective of their loved one who is dead. Now, Aussies, I shouldn't need to say it, but steel caskets are not a thing over here. Wood is where it's at. And I called around a few local funeral homes to ask about steel caskets, and after the initial, why would you want that? I had some interesting conversations. So we're going to take a quick detour while I tell you about one of them that kind of sums up the Australian thought on all of this. One of these conversations was with an older gentleman who had worked at this particular funeral home for over 30 years, and you've got to give him props for company loyalty right there. He said their home was one of those that SCI bought out in the 90s, and they were told to order in all these American-made caskets to sell. One of these was a steel casket. He said they got so many comments about it from clients who came in about how ghastly it was and who would want to be buried in a footlocker that they eventually took it off the floor and put it out back. When SCI left and InvoCare came in, this thing was still out back. He said up until 8 years ago, they just used it as extra storage. And then one day an apprentice said that would make a really cool looking planter box. And now it's filled with soil and flowers. He said, we were never going to get rid of it, so why not? Indeed, the only funeral home that didn't find my question strange was, naturally, the home I called that specialised in repatriation, who used them all the time. So, yeah. The countries have some big differences when it comes to caskets. BYO caskets. Okay, last one on caskets, I promise. In many US states, it is against the law for a funeral director to refuse to deal with people who have bought their own coffin wholesale, such as straight from the manufacturer or from Costco, etc. For a while there, many US funeral directors started charging corkage, you could say, a handling fee if you brought your own casket rather than buying one from them. And this practice was also quickly nipped in the bud. Australia doesn't have such laws, and funeral directors can and will deny you service if you bring your own coffin or casket. Some will be perfectly fine with you bringing your own casket, but there's no law that says that they have to be. Prepaid funerals. Having customers prepay for a funeral is great for business because they are guaranteed business in the future. In the US, this is seen by companies as an important part of the death care industry. Companies even send teams door-to-door cold selling and trying to get people to sign up. SCI, who if we haven't mentioned yet is still the biggest funeral corporation in the US, currently has around $6 billion tucked away in prepaid funerals. Here in Australia, however, we don't seem to be that big on the prepaid funeral idea. It's there if you want it, shockingly mainly from InvoCare, but it isn't marketed all that hard. You might occasionally see an ad on TV once a year, but that's about it. If you are thinking about it, while there are pros and cons to it, be reassured that every Australian state and territory has strong legislation in place to keep the industry's prepaid deals honest. But you must tell those around you that you have it, along with your will and everything else I keep harping on about. Memorials. Having a solid place to mourn and remember your loved one has traditionally been a grave with a headstone, large monuments to victims of catastrophes, and columbariums to put the ashes so you know where they are. Us Aussies do have a bit of that in us, but it's mostly the older generation. The way a simple wooden cross and flowers almost immediately pops up at the roadside after a fatal road accident, for example, is much more likely to bring people together in remembrance than the actual grave of the victim itself. But we are less likely to create massive statues and buildings in memory of large-scale catastrophes. But in the US, they do create these a lot. There is a different way of community mourning over there, which stems from different societal attitudes and values than what we have over here. Body disposal alternatives. This is an interesting one, because while there is no doubt that the USA has far more body disposal methods available to them than Australia does, they're not always good. Yes, you can have human composting over there and natural burial, but they'll also send your ashes into space and have your body plasticized. Now, there is a lot of literature about why this is, and go check out our death book recommendation video for a few of them. But it seems to come down to freedom, I can do whatever I want, and an attempt to immortalize themselves in some way. And you gotta love that death denial. So while they have alternatives to burial and cremation, they aren't always exactly environmentally friendly and sustainable alternatives. The other point here is they have the population where just a tiny percentage could keep a company in business. You got a company turning ashes into diamonds or putting cremains in tattooing? Cool, you've got enough clientele to keep yourself in business. That's not the case here in Australia. We have one aquamation facility in Adelaide, of all places, that isn't going great because even if we had the same percentage as the USA wanting to use it, that actual number is incredibly low, and that's hard for a business. The other thing is attitude. The USA, and we see this all the time on the news, when they want something as a society, they will really go for it with strong gusto and motivation. And that's how they have made so much change in allowing for these different body disposal methods to exist. But us Aussies, we're kind of known for our laid-back attitude. So we very rarely get enthusiastic about saying what we want and getting up and making societal change. Though strangely enough, if we don't want something, we will absolutely make that known. And if you want to know what body disposal methods we actually do have in Australia, go check out our video on the topic and the link will be in the description. Donated bodies. Of all the death topics that the US media has screwed us Aussies over with, body donation has to be at the top of the pile. The amount of times I hear, particularly from my parents' generation, that they don't want to donate their body to science because they don't want it used for military training practice is infuriating. So I will say this very bluntly. Australia has some of the strongest laws in the world when it comes to body donation and what can be done with body parts. The US, on the other hand, has some of the weakest laws in this area, which is why the black market for body parts is big business over there. And that's how grandma ended up as target practice. If you donate your body to science here in Australia, its potential use is confined to traditional areas and surgical training and the teaching of anatomy, and only used by universities. And when Sydney's University of Tech wanted to open up the body farm for forensic study, it took 6 years of jumping through legal hoops to make that happen. So your body is going nowhere near the military. Well, that was a long one, wasn't it? Any of the videos we mentioned in this video, you will find their links in the description, so go check them out. And I hope this gives the Aussies here a bit of clarity about the difference between the two countries' death industries. It is very important that we are aware of the facts for our country and not confuse them with somewhere else. So with that, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and now go talk death.